From the heart of Central Florida, you are listening to the most electrifying show in media, A Neighbor's Choice. And I'm your host, your neighbor, David Gornoski. So glad to be with you again here in our hometown in Central Florida, where the problems we have, they're not that hard to solve. We just got to learn to roll up our sleeves and solve them together, individually working as human persons, not being cogs in collectivism, not being cogs in the crowd as we go along with bystander effect. That's not going to work. That worked for a while, but it's not going to work for solving the problems that really matter in our lives today. So that's what I'm happy to be with you to do and to discuss, is sorting through the groupthink, sorting through what we have seen in the hysteria surrounding this pandemic. What happens is that human beings are prone to succumb to fitting in to the peer pressure of what the selected experts recommend when there's times of change, times of difference. And so that's what we're going to explore today. So our guest today is someone that he's got an article just came out and spiked online and some other publications. Daily Caller did a story about him and what he's saying. He's an assistant professor of political science at Kentucky State University. Wilfred Reilly, how you doing?
I'm doing pretty well. Thanks for having me on the show.
Yeah, great to hear from you. And I saw some of your article and some of the interviews you've done. And you're noted for kind of breaking through sacred cows. So you've come to the right program. That's what we do. But you've got some books out, Hate, Crime, Hoax, and Taboo, 10 Facts You Can't Talk About. But now you've turned your attention and your analysis of data and empirical data to suggest that perhaps there is no solid empirical evidence that the lockdowns are working in the way they were supposed to work.
Yeah, that's pretty much accurate. So one of the things that I do, I'm a quantitative methodologist by training. I'm a quantitative political scientist. I teach a lot of the methods classes at a pretty solid U.S. state university. And one of the things I'm interested in is whether these phenomena that are constantly discussed on the political left and on the extremely hard right actually pan out when you look at them using real data. So, I mean, one of my books, Hate, Crime, Hoax, took a look at the fact that over the past couple of years, something like half of the most prominent, very publicized hate crime allegations, I mean, running through them very quickly, Jussie Smollett, Covington Catholic, Erica Thomas, the awful dreadlock cutting case in D.C., Yasmin Saweed with the torn hijab, most of the University of Missouri situation, those turned out in the end to be fakes or at least exaggerations. And I got interested in why that was, how we can tell a hoax, what we've done in terms of creating this culture of victimization. That was Hate, Crime, Hoax. I've written another book called Taboo that's devoted entirely to looking at some of these things. The claims of the Black Lives Matter movement, for example. Do young black and white men frequently attack one another? Do cops frequently attack black men? It turns out the answer is no. I mean, about 90% of crimes intra-racial, person most likely to kill you is your ex-wife. When interracial crime does occur, I mean, in my community, we need to take some responsibility for this. That's around 70% black on white, minority on white. So a lot of these narratives just don't turn out to be true. I'm currently prepping a book called Alt Wrongs that looks at the same kind of extreme claims on the hard right, that diverse societies never function. That hasn't been true since ancient Rome. But the coronavirus piece came about because someone mentioned, well, why don't you use those same techniques, OLS regression, this kind of thing, to look at whether the coronavirus lockdowns actually have dramatically reduced death. Someone pointed out there, a buddy of mine who actually is a doctor, a medical doctor. You know, we've got 7 states, big states, Utah, Nebraska, South Carolina, that did not lock down. I'm sure they closed certain extremely non-essential businesses we could debate, but that never issued shelter-in-place orders, that kept religious services open. That's a big one, so on. Are there more deaths in those states? And to make a long story short, what I did in about a 6-page article is I took a look first at whether in these non-lockdown social distancing states there were more deaths on average. So I found out, no. If you go through that entire set from Utah over to South Dakota, you've got on average 1,613 deaths per state, terrible, of course, or cases per state, and 33 deaths. If you compare that to the states that are locked down, that decided to go with lockdowns accompanied by releases for things like Walmart, you on average had 8,408 cases and 342 deaths. The next thing was, well, even though some of them are pretty substantial, I mean, you've got Omaha, you've got Salt Lake City in the states I was looking at, almost certainly the social distancing states are a little smaller than the lockdown states. So I adjusted for population, and I started looking at COVID-19 cases and deaths per million. And I found pretty much the same thing. I mean, in the social distancing, non-lockdown states, you're talking about an average of 729 cases per million. This is with population fully adjusted for, and 12 deaths. Whereas in the lockdown state, where people are concentrated at home with a number of other individuals, you've got an average of 1,392 cases per million and 54 deaths. So the social distancing states where people are encouraged to go outside, do some exercise, are doing better still. And finally, I ran what's called a regression model, where I looked at the impact of a bunch of things: population density, median income, median age, diversity, which some people were arguing would have a big impact. Minorities get hit hardest. And again, strategy, lockdown or social distancing on coronavirus deaths. And what I found is, again, that there's no impact. Whether you chose to lock down or whether you chose to encourage just well-done social distancing did not dramatically impact the death rate. The slight advantage for social distancing, but I can't say I proved my case either. It didn't have much effect. What had a big effect was population density. So in these large cities like New York, Chicago, you're going to have a tough time no matter what you do. But even in a sizable place like Omaha, Nebraska, I mean, you might not need to lock everyone inside the building.
So it's very interesting, but this is something, I mean, have you received some responses from the academic community that looked at your data analysis?
Yeah, I mean, I've received positive responses. I've received negative responses. One of the things that I always do with all of my data, and this is true for my data on hoax hate crimes, data on the very extreme right, data on, for example, transgender murder rate. I found that was not epidemic. That was another piece for Quillette. All my data is publicly available. This is as well. I've had several hundred people write me and request it, and the general consensus is, it's a small but well-put-together data set. I mean, what I find is true. Again, no one piece of scientific research is perfect, which is something to remember, by the way, when you look not just at me on kind of the center-right, but also at Fauci and some of these scientific models that kind of shut down a lot of society. But so, I mean, there are some things that you could say in response to what I wrote. I mean, for example, I use overall coronavirus cases as what's called a dependent variable. You could argue that I could use or should use current active cases. I don't have a date at which the epidemic begins variable, call it date of onset variable in the model. That was fairly similar for most U.S. states, but I've had methodologists argue, well, 2 weeks could make a difference. One thing I plan on doing for the next essay is looking at whether, the rates of increase in cases have been a little lower for the lockdown states and the social distancing states. But in terms of that basic point, that if you go to Utah or you go to Sweden or you go to Nebraska and you're in a very urban area, there aren't bodies in the streets. I mean, people have been pretty receptive to that. I mean, I think most people just say, well, that's a fact.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that I think people need to understand here is that the media and the entertainment outlets and a lot of businesses and their advertising are constantly saying we must follow the experts, we must follow the experts, we must follow the experts. But there is no one expert voice. This is a contested theory, as you've demonstrated. Your expertise in analyzing data has demonstrated that there's a lot of room for disputing the legitimacy of this approach of a one-size-fits-all lockdown approach for months, apparently, is where a lot of folks want to take it, as a way to actually mitigate deaths. And another thing, did you look into, or maybe you can look into, is the fact that if you're flattening the curve of infection, what's going to happen when the second or third waves come around and more people die as a result of not developing a herd immunity amongst the young faster?
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of things to look at there. So, I mean, first of all, your comment about we're advised to follow the experts. Experts are wrong all the time. There's an old saying in science, if you're fairly good, if you go to the conferences, that apocalyptic, statistically significant findings are what gets published. So if you go back through history, I mean, you'll see things like Paul Ehrlich's The Population Bomb, for example, where he estimated that increases in population, if they continued at the rate at which they were going during the sexual revolution in the 70s, would cause massive starvation within a couple of decades. That never happened. People became a bit more faithful again, and you saw the development of chemical birth control. And you've seen this over and over again. I mean, peak oil, the Club of Rome, the ozone hole, acid rain, killer bees, and the Great Northerly Migration. So, one, I think, obviously, while we don't need crazy talk science, it's important to realize that experts are wrong very often, and there generally are disputes in the expert community. So that's point one. And if you're talking specifically about coronavirus, I mean, there's an entire team of scientists from him that people listening should Google called In the Coronavirus Crisis, We're Making Decisions Without Reliable Data. Where this group of people argues that there almost certainly are many, many more people with coronavirus, with COVID-19, than we know about, because the tests until recently were so unavailable. So in much of the heartland United States, to take a coronavirus test, you had to be, one, sick and what's called symptomatic. You had to, two, be able to show that you had actually come into close contact with somebody who had COVID-19. And for a while in Kentucky, they would actually call that person. And three, you had to be willing to call a hospital and go through this scary 30-minute screening process. So these scary death rates of 2%, 3%, those come from the pool of almost totally sick people, something like half of whom tested positive, that took the first tests. And the Stanford guys have pointed out that if you just look at the number of people that were advised, for example, by doctors in their hospital community to stay home with a quote-unquote funky flu, that have probably had COVID-19, that must be 50 or 85 times the pool of people who officially tested positive. So the deaths for COVID-19, if you're conducting a well-done mathematical survey, are going to come out of that larger pool of everyone who had that disease, rather than that smaller pool of officially tested, sick, symptomatic, influential seniors. The Stanford approach is a little theoretical for me, but these are the kind of debates that are actually going on in the community. I mean, what's the infection rate? What's the death rate? Experts disagree about all of that. One, experts are wrong fairly often. Two, and I think you raised, and this kind of last sentence of me going on here, but you raised another point, which is what about trade-offs? So even if we assume the experts are right, the disease might have a 0.5% CFR, for example, might be very dangerous. What's going to happen if we encourage everyone to stay home to flatten the curve and we don't get a vaccine in 6 months, which we probably won't? Are people then going to leave their homes with less money but facing the same level of risk that we're facing now? All that is stuff that has to be intelligently discussed. So even if I'm wrong, and I don't think I am, but any legitimate scientist should admit that possibility, even in that case, you're still facing the remarkable trade-off of how long do we keep 26 million people out of the workforce to try to save, say, 60,000 lives? That's a real question.
We're talking with Professor Wilfred Reilly of Kentucky State University, unpacking the data behind the lockdowns. We're live. You're listening to A Neighbor's Choice. I'm David Gornoski. Hold on. We'll be right back.
A lawsuit is a devastating process for families. It can be an emotional roller coaster ride. There is a law firm in Tampa Bay that practices with this in mind. That law firm is Catania & Catania. We know and handle personal injury law for families with care. If it's an auto accident, medical malpractice, nursing home negligence, unsafe working conditions, or motorcycle accidents, the law firm of Catania & Catania will take care of the process worry-free from start to finish. Many victims don't even realize they can claim compensation for their loss until they talk to us. Catania & Catania only represent private individuals. We treat every case as if it's going to trial. Putting families first is more than just a slogan. It's our way of practicing law. It's our commitment to you. Remember, we don't get paid if you don't get paid. So go to CataniaCatania.com, award-winning, over 28 years, and family first. Catania, personal injury, auto accident, and motorcycle accident attorneys.
Attorney spokeswoman.
Got Diacos? My name is synonymous with breast surgery. If you want better breasts, let me, Dr. Dan Diaco, help. I'm a board-certified plastic surgeon with over 20 years of experience and have performed over 5,000 breast procedures. If you want perkier breasts, whether bigger or smaller, let me help. Are you tired of loose or sagging skin in your face, neck, breasts, or tummy? Let me, Dr. Dan Diaco, a board-certified plastic surgeon with 20 years of experience, help you. I use the latest technology such as Face Tight and Body Tight to both tighten skin and remove fat without scars.
United we stand. That's never been more important than it is today. Now you can show your commitment to our president and the nation with the limited edition Trump 2020 American Eagle Silver Dollars. Show your support with the limited edition American Silver Eagles, specially priced from government.com. Just call 1-800-571-6468. Hold the weight of democracy in your hand with new, perfect, uncirculated condition Silver Eagle coins. These historic coins, signed into law by Reagan, have been America's money since 1986. To secure your new limited edition Trump 2020 American Eagle Silver Dollar coins, call 1-800-571-6468. Call now and we'll give you a free Trump 2020 Patriots Pack, including a Declaration of Independence commemorative and 5 Lincoln cents when you order. Call now to secure your silver dollar coins, plus get your free Trump 2020 Patriots Pack, valued at over $10, free with every order. 1-800-571-6468. That's 1-800-571-6468.
Looking for cheap flights or cheap tickets? Call the low-cost airline travel hotline now for prices so low we can't publish them anywhere. We'll even save you money with cheap travel deals on hotels, rental cars, even complete travel packages. Call us first for the absolute cheapest prices on U.S. and international airline tickets and hotels.
800-811-3471. 800-811-3471. That's 800-811-3471.
No empirical evidence that the lockdowns are working as intended. That's the subject of my guest's article on Spiked Online that's generated a lot of discussion. We have Professor Wilfred Reilly with us of the Kentucky State University, and Professor Reilly has a lot of work in data analysis. That's what he does as a political scientist. And Professor Reilly, I wanted to get into a few things. I know we don't have too much time, but let's see if we can run through a few things. You know, one of the things that I think is bizarre to me is how the media and a lot of the chosen, selected experts that are not expert, they're not the final experts, they're not the final say. There's a lot of experts that disagree, but the ones that always seem to get the voice in the media, it seems like it's almost taboo to bring up the notion that perhaps this virus has been around in the population earlier than when we decided to start panicking about it. And I think, I mean, come on, how you know, how primitive that kind of way of cajoling public opinion is when you think about it. Because, you know, if Wuhan has had this thing, let's say January or maybe a little earlier, but just say January when everybody says it was going on, and you have one of the most highly, travel times in their culture. They're flying around all over the world. There's no travel restrictions yet at first. You've got a lot of them coming to Italy, and you know a lot of Americans are going to Italy every day before everything went the way it went. So, I mean, this notion that it's taboo or spooky to suggest that this virus has been working itself in the American population a lot earlier than when we started freaking out about it, I just don't understand where the basis is for this logically.
Well, I think that's a fascinating conversation we could get into, and that I would like to talk about here on another show, which is that culture of safetyism, like why it is considered so taboo to point out that often risk just exists in life, or often we don't even really know what the risks are when you balance good against bad. This comes up with gun control. This comes up with climate change. So I think that idea of we don't want to talk about possibilities other than panic is something you see well beyond COVID. The scientific point you're making, I don't think is all that debatable, actually. So right now we're starting to do what's called random serological testing. So I pointed out what we in science call a denominator problem when it comes to these horrifying 2% and so on COVID-19 death rates. And that's that we don't know how many people actually have COVID-19. The people that have taken the test, and I think it's fair to say this, are only sick, symptomatic, mostly much older individuals, a lot of testing in hospitals, a lot of testing in nursing homes, who are willing to take that scary test. So it's not surprising that you've got a 34% positive rate and a 2 or 3% death rate at all. In reality, in the population, many, many doctors have pointed out, have said openly on the medical blogs, said openly on talk shows and in articles, we're referring probably 50 to 100 people to colleagues of ours in the profession, or just telling them to stay home with quote-unquote funky flu, with potential COVID, as it's called, for each person that we're bringing in and officially testing. So almost certainly there are a large block of people, we don't want to speculate or exaggerate about that number, but there are a large block of people that have had COVID-19 that have not tested, and the reality of that is lowering the death rate. The only real question, I think, from a methods perspective is how big that group is. But this is what you brought up. We're now starting to test. So in Germany, for example, in Bonn, Germany, they did a test for COVID-19 antibodies, and they found that 15% of people, of Germans, tested positive for COVID-19 at present or at some point months in the past. And that would mean that the actual death rate for the virus, as I recall, was 0.3%. Out of 1,000 people who got COVID-19, 3 would die. That's still terrible. It's 3 times flu, but it's a tenth of what we've been hearing. And we're not as experienced, without being glib, with these sort of plagues as the Asians or many Europeans. We're just now ramping up to do this in the USA. So in Miami, we did a similar study. Correct me if I'm wrong, but 7% of people tested positive for past COVID antibodies, and that would put the death rate for the disease in an American city where people tend to be, for a couple of reasons, believe it or not, healthier than many Europeans, at around 0.2 or 0.21%. So what that implies is that COVID-19 has been here for a while. We don't know how long, but perhaps a month before the first recorded case. And it implies that many, many people have already had the disease. When we had that terrible winter flu season where there were some deaths and so many people were reporting these new symptoms, that might have been the onset of COVID-19. Again, we don't want to speculate, but there's no reason to assume that's not true when we're looking at something like a 15% antibody rate. All of this is stuff that is now coming to light that, you're right, is not really being discussed so much in the be afraid, be very afraid sector of the media.
So why is it taboo? On what basis should we consider it taboo to ask that basic question? I mean, free travel is going on in this city for months. Many of those Wuhan workers were working in northern Italy, I believe. There was a lot of back and forth. Americans are going to Italy all the time. Why? I mean, it's laughable that we have a media, and not just media, but the selected experts that they highlight, that make this question taboo itself. Why? I'm trying to get at a little bit more of the political science part of this, you know?
I think that there are two components to that. One is that there is an extreme culture of safetyism in America. We were, until fairly recently, a warrior society, which in general I approve of as businessman, former athlete, this sort of thing. We had a military draft for all males. We're probably both registered for the draft now, but an actual military draft was stretched until, I believe, 1974. So traditionally, we have not had an extraordinarily safety-conscious culture, for good or ill. But in recent years, we've started hearing more and more of these statements like the one you often hear around COVID, not one life. Where the idea is that bringing up things that are true, but that could cause conflict or disputation or that could potentially put someone at risk is a bit forbidden. And you see this across the board with a whole range of things. I mean, one of the most controversial things I said in Taboo, the book, was simply that the media's portrayal of interracial crime is wildly slanted. So, for example, you saw Black Lives Matter, which was the presentation of, all of these cases of young African-American men being shot by police. If you actually take a look at the data, there are less than 1,000 people shot by the police in a typical year. Only about 25% of them are African-American. Black people make up almost 15% of the U.S. population and have a slightly but definitely higher crime rate. not much of an issue there at all. And if you look at interracial crime more broadly, it's 70% or more minority on white. And when I've talked to friends in the media about why they don't discuss this, the idea was, that would cause conflict, it would cause hostility, it might lead to racism. I don't know why it's thus considered cool to discuss white on black violence, but many, many things are kind of forbidden. They're not brought up very much in the public sector, and this seems to be one of them. It's the idea that these sort of edgy, perhaps conservative ideas could lead to harm. I think that's point one, culture of safetyism. Point two, I think, is that there are a lot of people out there, some in the media, certainly many in the political and activist sector, that would like to use COVID-19. And this is me just talking as a political scientist and as a center-right guy. This isn't methodological. But there are a lot of people that would like to use COVID-19 to dramatically reshape American society, in my opinion.
Right.
So you keep hearing these comments from, for example, Ilhan Omar. Well, the science on the other side may be almost as valid as ours, but why take the risk? Why don't we just, her suggestion was that the government print $2 trillion bills and use those as collateral to float money to people until the crisis is over.
Right.
So the idea there is, why don't we use this to totally transition our society? I think there are a lot of people who are advocating for that, whether that's national health care and so on down the line.
And I'm very skeptical that the American public is as wildly supportive of these draconian measures as they are reported to be. I do think, though, that there's another issue here, and we'll have to have another segment, another time to unpack it further. But just for now, this idea that governments naturally are going to bias the opinions of experts that always associate with expansion of government power. So, for example, there's a hotly contested debate amongst many economists about whether printing money, as you had mentioned, is something that is safe and healthy for the economy long term, or whether it destroys the purchasing power and so on. But those economists are never in the universities, they're never in the academic settings or the government positions to even have their voice heard. The same goes for nutrition. There's a hotly contested debate that the food pyramid and its insulin resistance causing carbohydrates that they shoved down the American people for decades is one of the key issues that is linked to comorbidities with this virus being fatal. And yet no one has ever talked about this in public press conferences by the federal government or state governments. And so again, you're not getting a fair science by any basic standard. There's an obvious conflict of interest here in which the experts that are always heard from are always the ones that are for the expansion of government support and government spending and so on.
Yeah, I don't think that's a coincidence. And I think it leads, I don't think that there are conspiracies that run the world. I don't think that there's a cabal of 3 senators, 5 reporters, 4 businessmen, so on, sitting in a room somewhere in D.C. deciding what the strategy for some kind of takeover is going to be in the USA. But I do think that people tend to associate with people that have similar ideas and similar incentives, and that tends to produce what we call narratives or what we call heuristics. So, I mean, it was Pew Research back in 2004. The study's never been replicated, but it's also never been challenged, found that 93% of the people in mainstream media were either leftist or left-leaning moderates. 7% were conservatives of any kind, which includes center-right business people, which includes libertarians, so on down the line. When you put that level, and I mean, you can find the same thing on the right, by the way. I'm pretty sure the military makes decisions in a traditionalist conservative manner. But when you put that kind of Pew Research level of bias together with what you're seeing in academia, what you're seeing from the political party that's most active on some of these COVID questions, so on, yeah, you're going to get one narrative that's presented to people as the mainstream narrative because it's endorsed by probably 70% of the people that are talking about this. So just, I mean, really quickly, there basically are only 2 approaches to COVID-19 since we don't have a vaccine, and Gilead says it's going to be 14 months until one is developed. The first approach is that, quite frankly, we train people that are young and fit really well in social distancing. We put on our work boots, we go back to work, and perhaps 100,000 people die. It sounds horrible to put it that way, but that's what has historically happened in disease epidemics. There's not much government role beyond the local. Everyone supports the local doctor, pats him on the back at church. That is greatly appreciated. or wherever else you might choose to be, men's athletic league, something like that. But beyond that, there's not that much you can do. You do your social distancing, you go to work. There's not really that much outside assistance that's really needed. Diseases come. We had a terrible flu season in 1819. We still call that the Spanish flu or the Great Influenza. I mean, some of my older uncles remember the Asian flu. That was 57, 58. I mean, it wasn't quite as serious as this, but we lost, I believe, 25,000 people to SARS. So traditionally in the past, that's been the response to these epidemics. You put on your medical mask and you go to work. The alternative option is that we dramatically increase the size of government so that for perhaps 6 months until we get some kind of therapy or an expedited vaccine or something like that, or maybe the full 12 to 14, we can receive money from the state, we can be protected by the state, we can be forgiven our rent by the state, so that nobody has to go out there and take that risk like we've done every other time. But the problem with that, I mean, the snake waiting behind the piece of fruit, is that that's communism. I mean, if we give the government that extraordinary level of power, they are not going to pull it back ever. So that's the choice.
Yeah, and I think so perhaps we have a different contagion that we are catching from China, and that's this appetite for this weird crony capitalist mixed with communist control. Very scary to think about that. So glad to have some honest experts like yourself to help balance the perspective in a discussion that is very much needed. So thank you, Professor Wilfred Reilly, and we'll talk to you soon again. I'd like to pick your mind about some of the things that I've been studying in anthropology as it pertains to why humans have this proclivity to do the same patterns we see whenever there's a conflict. But that's for another time.
Sounds good. Well, thanks for having me on this time.
And yeah, very good. We'll follow your work. We'll continue live on A Neighbor's Choice. I'm David Gornoski. We're live, and you don't want to miss what's coming next.
A lawsuit is a devastating process for families. It can be an emotional roller coaster ride. There is a law firm in Tampa Bay that practices with this in mind. That law firm is Catania & Catania. We know and handle personal injury law for families with care. If it's an auto accident, medical malpractice, nursing home negligence, unsafe working conditions, or motorcycle accidents, the law firm of Catania & Catania will take care of the process worry-free from start to finish. Many victims don't even realize they can claim compensation for their loss until they talk to us. Catania & Catania only represent private individuals. We treat every case as if it's going to trial. Putting families first is more than just a slogan. It's our way of practicing law. It's our commitment to you. Remember, we don't get paid if you don't get paid. So go to CataniaCatania.com, award-winning, over 28 years, and family first. Catania & Catania, personal injury, auto accident, and motorcycle accident attorneys.
Attorney spokeswoman. Coronavirus is threatening the entire world. Could you protect you and your family? Even getting tested can cost you up to $3,200 out of pocket. Would you be able to afford that for you and your family? Well, free Obamacare will cover and protect today. New insurance may cost you nothing. Zero premium plans are available. If you've lost your job, you must call 877-652-0244 or text VIRUS to 919191 or log on to freeobamacare.com. Call us today. We'll get you enrolled, get you qualified coverage to protect you from not only this outbreak, but day in and day out sickness and illness. Our plans cover visits, testing, emergency and urgently needed care, medications, and more. Now more than ever, you need to act now and call now. No long lines, and we can get you coverage today. That's 877-652-0244 or text VIRUS to 919191. That's 877-652-0244.
Well, we just heard from Professor Wilfred Reilly, someone who is a data analyst who knows how to unpack the data and look for empirical evidence when it comes to claims, particularly apocalyptic or extreme claims that we hear pushed around in media. And his article has in his work is that he's continued to do suggests that there really is no basis. There is no empirical evidence that when you compare states and countries that have had voluntary social distancing largely versus states that have used top-down lockdown policies, there isn't really a difference in terms of the fatality rates. And that's the empirical data. There's just not a lot of evidence that suggests that that is a thing that's played out thus far. And so that needs to continue to be investigated, but that needs to be said, right? And you got a dishonest media that doesn't want to have their groupthink bubble popped. They just don't. I don't know why. There's a lot of people that can, give you their theories for it. But what I can say from looking at anthropology, which is the study of humans and how we became who we are as civilization, what happens there is that you'll see that these patterns have happened before in history. And one of the things I think is important is how much sacred aura we bestow upon the wisdom of those who are in charge of governance. We believe that they're almost like a priestly caste, and the media acts as a scribal caste. They're writing, the scribes. They're in ancient times, you had scribes that would write down the holy texts or the mythologies, and they would preserve it generationally and make sure that the mythology and the events that were recorded for that people's collective memory would be in alignment with the ruling hierarchy and how it was meant to be preserved. I mean, so there was always a relationship between the scribes, which were the ancient form of media, and the government elites, who are the ones who maintain the status quo of hierarchies through their different rituals and taboos and rule keeping and enforcement, and most importantly, their narratives. Those narratives that we inherit today oftentimes infect us in ways that we don't understand. For example, you've heard the saying, "It is better that one man die than the whole nation perish." That's from Caiaphas, the high priest that was recorded to have, stirred on the execution call against Jesus. And so in that sentence, "It is better that one man die than the whole nation perish," that is still at the heart of the policy processes of governments today. They still, I would argue, and make an anthropological case that governments themselves are vestiges of that older primitive form of religion that used to bind communities together. Remember, there was no word to distinguish between religion and state in the ancient world for much of our history. Those words, government and religion, there was no distinction in those words. Culture, religion, government, all synonymous, right? These are not distinct terms until we come along recently in modern history and try to, in our little left brain side of our minds, sort, categorize, chop, isolate, and do the little weird obsession we have with breaking knowledge apart. And sometimes it just leads us into ignorance, oftentimes, more often than we would suspect. But that desire to sort, categorize, and isolate these terms and make these things distinct things has really served us very poorly, especially in times like facing a pandemic. Remember, ancient societies, they were designed very effectively in their time to deal with pandemics. And the tactic that they would use is the same as that sentence I just said. It's better that one person die than the whole nation perish. Meaning, we're going to sacrifice some to save the many, right? Well, that's kind of, in some ways, if you would ask the average governments and their leaders and bureaucrats today, when they do their little press conferences to a sycophantic press, if you ask them today, what are you doing? What's your motivation for, and they would say, we want to save, we don't want to have any life destroyed. So we want to do whatever we can to preserve all lives. And that means using the force of government law against nonviolent choices or interactions or assembly or what have you. That whole premise is something that states today cling to. They say it's better that the many are sacrificed than that one should perish, right? And they flip that little narrative, and that's what they say they're trying to, guide their policy narrative through, which is this idea that sacrifice is necessary. Sacrifice for all of us. We all must sacrifice through forceful government policies from the top down so that not one extra person has to die that wouldn't if we didn't do the sacrificial imposition from our governments. So do you see how they try to flip it? But in reality, it's the same thing from the ancient past. So the marketing, label, the brand is trying to flip the way of the old world. The old world, it's better that one person dies than the whole nation perish from a plague. Now, our governments de facto say, no, all of us must sacrifice so that not one more person has to die that wouldn't die. That not one more person has to die if we enact this sacrificial imposition on everyone. But in reality, they're still sacrificing some for the many. They can't escape that framework that they've inherited from thousands of years ago, as anthropological evidence would suggest. This need to sacrifice through force, through what we would call aggression or violence, has been with us whenever there's a stressful moment. And we have a hard time shaking our faith in that knee-jerk tendency that communities fall back to. Somebody has to be sacrificed for the greater good. And in this case, we're sacrificing millions of people's liberties on the narrative that this is necessary to stop one more person from dying from this new illness. It's just not an accurate depiction of what's happening, though, because those same government people and their cronies in academia and corporations who push this mantra that the only solution is forced lockdowns, not only is there no clear empirical evidence and data to suggest that they're right, but they also fail to mention the clear and growing evidence that indicts to the fullest the pseudoscience and quackery that has been pushed as nutrition from food pyramid and nutritional so-called experts for generations. And that has created this dynamic that we're in today, where people are faced with insulin resistance as this new novel virus shows up. And that's what the closest link is to having fatal issues or severe cases of this virus, is eating the quackery, pseudoscience nutrition of massive amounts of carbohydrates and vegetable oils. We'll continue live on A Neighbor's Choice. Don't miss it. We'll be right back.
A lawsuit is a devastating process for families. It can be an emotional roller coaster ride. There is a law firm in Tampa Bay that practices with this in mind. That law firm is Catania & Catania. We know and handle personal injury law for families with care. If it's an auto accident, medical malpractice, nursing home negligence, unsafe working conditions, or motorcycle accidents, the law firm of Catania & Catania will take care of the process worry-free from start to finish. Many victims don't even realize they can claim compensation for their loss until they talk to us. Catania & Catania only represent private individuals. We treat every case as if it's going to trial. Putting families first is more than just a slogan. It's our way of practicing law. It's our commitment to you. Remember, we don't get paid if you don't get paid. So go to CataniaCatania.com, award-winning, over 28 years, and family first. Catania & Catania, personal injury, auto accident, and motorcycle accident attorneys.
Attorney spokeswoman. More and more these days, you hear TV news reports like this.
A tornado struck this morning, destroying at least 40 homes.
Or this.
The wildfires have already swept over 50,000 acres.
Or this.
Thousands have fled the area as the hurricane whipped across more than 80 miles of coastline.
Natural disasters not only devastate people, but pets who get separated from their owners, as well as wildlife. What happens to these animals? Thousands of them are rescued and placed in caring homes and shelters, thanks to the NAV Sanctuary Fund, where 100% of donations are used to mend their broken bodies and make their shattered lives whole again. To learn more about the NAV Sanctuary Fund, the program that immediately delivers helpless animals from dire crisis, call 888-6287 or log on to navs.org. You can make an immediate difference. Log on to navs.org today.
My son, Chris, was almost 18.
My sister was 4.
My brother, Jeff, was 16.
Evan was in college.
Chris was in high school.
My daughter, Lauren, was in preschool.
It happened in March.
In October.
I got it in July.
Meningococcal disease. It can happen to anyone, anywhere, anytime, and the effects can be devastating.
You can almost feel it racing through your body, destroying it.
Lauren lost a hand, her feet, and nearly her life.
It killed my brother in 18 hours.
Vaccination is the best protection. Today, health officials recommend immunization for children ages 11 through 18.
This infection moves quickly. Parents need to move quicker. Immunization can save your child's life.
To learn more about preventing meningitis, visit our website at nmaus.org or call 1-866-366-3662. A public service message from the National Meningitis Association.
A Neighbor's Choice is back. I'm David Gornoski, your host. You can email me, david@aneighborschoice.com, if you have a story suggestion or a comment or question. That's david@aneighborschoice.com. And we have, a post here by a friend of our program, Carrie Baldwin, who says, Zuckerberg has said he will shut down pages and profiles promoting lockdown protests. So she says, if that happens to me, you can find me on Minds, or you can subscribe to our monthly newsletter. So this is what's going to happen, folks. You have this crazy, I just don't understand what's going through the minds of these people on Facebook, that Mark Zuckerberg, and then you have YouTube CEO saying we're going to destroy anything that goes against the WHO. I mean, come on. What in the world are these people thinking? Why do they have such a hatred for free thought? I mean, as we've demonstrated with our interview today on the program with Professor Wilfred Reilly, the experts who know the data have shown that it is a hotly disputed theory that a forced lockdown would do anything to mitigate the actual long-term fatality rate of this virus. And so the idea that a person like Mark Zuckerberg would use his platform to say, there will be no discussion. I know there's a theory that's contested, but there will be no discussion that's promoted in any fair way. And if you want to protest this, as is your right, God-given right, according to our founders, that will be deleted, those posts. Now, this is obviously a publisher. This is not in any way some kind of neutral platform. And I can't begin to understand how anyone, left or right, independent or what have you, could sit with a straight face and say, sounds like a great, trustworthy platform. YouTube, Google, Facebook, Twitter, where they're deleting people who are debating a hotly contested theory. Why are they so insecure? What are they scared of? Why are they so pitifully, pathetically insecure of thought? What's wrong with them? To have that kind of power that they've had, and to have that kind of position, and then to sell it all out. To sell it all out for what? Who do they think they are? They're not gods. They're just people. Just created a little website. And somehow they think that they can use that kind of cozy relationship with unaccountable global organization bureaucracies and unaccountable federal bureaucracies that don't get fired if something goes awry, that don't get their budgets cut or their pensions chopped or their jobs lost if their prescriptions go awry. In fact, they get the opposite. They get rewarded with more money the more failures they make for some reason. I don't understand it. But these people think that they can shred the spirit of free thought just like that when we have real experts, epidemiologists, data analysts, professors, doctors, virologists, nutritionists, all disputing with great arguments and great evidence, superior evidence to the pseudoscience basis for the hysteria of the media. And we're supposed to sit there with a straight face and think this is normal. I can't understand how insecure you could be to have the kind of traffic of a Google, YouTube, or Facebook, and to say, you know what, we have to stomp out any debate about this issue. What do they want from people? How can they live with themselves? Have they just numbed out their conscience and put themselves into such a stupor of groupthink that they just pathologically lie to themselves that somehow what they're doing is noble? They have no basis for that. So we can't sit by idly as passengers of a vehicle we have no control over and allow this kind of media to dominate the discourse of the next century. We cannot allow this kind of nonsense gutter publishers like these social media sites to dominate the discourse and stomp out discourse, to stomp out real science, to stomp out data. We cannot allow this to inherit the future of our culture. We have to beat it in the marketplace of ideas. We have to beat it in the marketplace itself. And we have to be honest with ourselves. If we cannot bear the truth about what we really see with our own eyes, then we have no hope. We have to tell the truth. We have to bear witness to the truth. We cannot play a game where we say, well, I just don't know how to do anything. What can I do? You, as one person, can be a role model that creates a ripple effect for hundreds and thousands of people around you to change everything for the good. So it's that bystander effect that we buy into that clouds our discernment, that limits our capacity to see what we can do, to love and serve those around us without relying on the use of force, without relying on insecure, pathetic tactics like the old media sites, old media TV channels, old media newspapers, and sadly, these old media, social media, arrogant children who run these sites and think that they have the ability to steer reality into whatever they want. They don't, because they're losing right now. They don't control the discourse. That's why they're so desperate and scratching at whatever they can. They sold out. They sold out. They sold our conscience out. But the public, we're going to work things together. And these people, of course, they have every opportunity to change their minds and stop being an impediment to freedom and health and progress. The choice is ours. Are we going to continue to let these little wannabe gods, these little tyrants, push us around? Or are we going to start speaking out, speaking with conviction, with humility, but with steadfast confidence that the truth is like a lion. Set it free, and it will defend itself. I'm David Gornoski. We'll see you tomorrow.